Hello, good evening. This is Sivarajan from Parti Sosialis Malaysia, and we are in a special show today with our guest from India. He's with the People's Dispatch, Comrade Prasanth. Welcome to Malaysia,
Thank you
Comrade.
so much. Good to be here.
All right. So today we're going to have a special show where we're going to discuss about a lot of things, big topics, and we are glad that Comrade is here to share some things. But I think firstly, Comrade, maybe you can just tell us a bit about your organization and what do you do?
Right. So People's Dispatch is an international, like you said, it's an international media organization. But it's a media organization founded on a very different premise, which is that news is not just about what the leaders of the world say, what the rich people of the world say. But news is, news, current affairs, whatever you call it, is actually what comes from the day-to-day lives of people, from the struggles of people. So at People's Dispatch, what we have been trying to do is to sort of redefine international news a bit, so to speak, so that the discussion is really about what are the struggles that people are engaging in on a regular basis, people across the world, workers, farmers, say marginalized communities, indigenous communities. What are the struggles that these people are engaging across the world? So I think we have this bad tendency often in media to sort of see struggles and protests as disruptive things, right? So we see them as say things that are out of the norm, as violence, as things that are to be frowned upon. But the fact is that struggle is a very essential part of human life. If you organized struggle, that too is a very essential part of human life. Humans have been organizing since the beginning of society. So we see there's these kind of struggles is very essential to how we understand society. So we don't want to only talk about struggles when there is, say, some kind of violence or whatever, and then suddenly all the media turns. So who are these people, right? We want to make normalized struggles and give it its rightful place in society. So that's one aspect. The second aspect also, I think, is to sort of look at news, all kinds of news, through the perspective of these movements. That why should only an academic expert, or why should only, say, some kind of a think tank be allowed to comment on an election, right? Why shouldn't the largest trade union in the country comment on election results? Why shouldn't the peasants movement of a country have a clear perspective? They do have a clear perspective. It's just that they're often not asked. So why should these movements not comment on trade policies, on elections, on anything to do with the country? So our second aim is to sort of bring this perspective, the perspective of these movements, to the analysis of all kinds of news. So that's really what People's Dispatch has been doing over the past. We're just about entering our 5th year. It's a bit of a difficult climb because international news is dominated by these few agencies. So it's a bit difficult to sort of, try to push back against that. But with the help of, I think, our friends from across the world, people in various movements, people in the midst of struggles, in the trenches of struggles, we have been able to actually, I think, manage to make a start or make a dent as far as we are concerned, I think.
Yes. So I think it's very important that maybe viewers probably can also access the People's Dispatch and to get more news on this. So basically, I've also been following the People's Dispatch, and I find that you cover a wide range of issues, international issues, not only from India but from all over the world. So I'd just like to look at few things which are happening now. Now, recently we know that some people say that the US has been on a downward slide, after the historical meeting between Chinese Premier Xi Jinping and the Russian President. There were some discussions about how their closeness, they're working together, and then there's a lot of discussions and debate about will the de-dollarization actually happen when they're saying that let us not use the dollar anymore.
Right.
Even our new Prime Minister, the Malaysian Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, spoke about it, that I think countries should move away from the dollar and they should look at trading in their own currencies under their own terms. Now, how significant is this shift where the economies of the world, developing world mainly, move away from the dollar? And does it really show that the US is losing its influence and hegemony? What do you think?
Right. So I think this is a very, like you said, it's a very complex question and there are many dimensions to it. But I think one or two things we need to note for quite some time. One is that we're at a transitional and transformative phase, no doubts, but it's still very early to sort of make clear predictions on what is likely to happen. So there are a lot of interesting trends, or let's say shoots, that are coming out, but how many of them will become big trees or plants is a bigger question. But I think there are definitely some trends that we can analyze. First of all, like you said, I think it is undoubtedly the fact that the age of US hegemony is definitely is coming to an end. Now, there are many reasons for that. One, of course, is the larger sort of crisis of capitalism that has been going on for quite some time now. There was the 2008 economic crisis, but even before that, we could see many of the signs and trends that were there. And that is, for instance, in the United States and in the Western countries, there has been a decline in actual production, a lot of which has actually shifted to the east. So there is a lot of wealth generation itself has really sort of, and that in some ways also explains the kind of right wing rise that we see in many of these regions as well. And secondly, I think equally importantly to note is that the United States, even while its economy has declined, has faced various blows, etc., has nonetheless continued to assert a very aggressive military policy and try to assert its hegemony militarily and through the control of international financial mechanisms, which means that basically today's global order is skewed massively in favor of the United States in various ways. Like, for instance, the most obvious way is the fact that they have about 800 military bases spread across the world. Now, you can ask, what is the relevance of the US having a military base in the center of Africa, or so many bases in West Asia, for instance, or in this part of the world? And a lot of it, of course, has to do with the control of resources, which the United States and its allies continue to extract in a huge way, especially from Africa. And a lot of it also has to sort of do with sort of attempt, I think, to push back or squash any attempt to create an alternative global system, whether it be financial, whether it be political, in whatever way. So the United States not only wants to prevent countries from working together if it feels that it's against its interests, it also wants to prevent domestic experiments which might create or provide an alternative, and we can come to some of that later as well. But there is, of course, like I said, that's the most direct way of trying to exert its hegemony. But there are other ways as well. For instance, the control it maintains over what is called the SWIFT digital payments mechanism, which pretty much is like the nervous system of international transactions. What it has done time and again is to cut countries out of SWIFT, which prevents them from engaging in any meaningful transactions, right? Or there is the question of sanctions. I think right now about 27% of the world's GDP is under sanctions right now. Various kinds of sanctions. Countries which produce 27% of the world's GDP are under sanctions right now. That's a huge amount. So how is it that, and most of these are not UN sanctions. At least UN sanctions were globally discussed. Many of these are unilateral sanctions. So how is it that a few countries can put such a huge percentage of the world's GDP under various kinds of sanctions? That is a very important question that everyone is asking these days. And I think the Russia-Ukraine war was a turning point for that, because until now, a lot of the countries which face these kind of sanctions were smaller countries. Cuba has been facing it for 60 years plus. Venezuela has been facing it for so many years. We have countries like, for instance, Zimbabwe. We have Iran, which has time and again faced sanctions. All these countries have been facing it. But when Russia was hit with these sanctions, it was at a qualitatively different level. And while the United States and its allies thought that Russia would crumble, it didn't. The Russian economy stood. The ruble's value did not crumble. It did not become rubble, as I think Joe Biden himself had predicted. Instead, it stood and performed quite well as well. And I think this sort of gave many countries two hints. Hint number one was the fact that no country is safe. Like if Russia, which is such a big economic player, can be targeted, tomorrow it could be Saudi Arabia. If Saudi Arabia does not follow the whims of the US as it commands, it could be Saudi Arabia, it could be any of its former allies as well. It could be countries with which it has good relations today, but tomorrow it could be something else. So I think many countries started getting worried about the use of sanctions in this manner. Secondly, I think it also Russia's ability to survive also showed that there are possibly other alternatives. And let's be clear, it's not only Russia. Even whether it be Cuba, whether it be Venezuela, whether it be Iran, all these countries suffered a lot, but they did not collapse as the US wanted them to. With a great deal of suffering, with a great deal of struggle, the people of all these countries did manage to somehow survive as well. And I think Russia's experiment showed that this is a possibility. And now there is also, because of this issue, the way sanctions have been imposed, there is further reason to sort of consider developing alternative systems. And I think that is this context in which de-dollarization, the discussion around it, is really picked up. And I think also important to note that sorry, with the Russia-Ukraine war, there has been a renewed interest in blocks of countries who are able to sort of chart a new course. Now, it's pretty much clear that one country alone can't chart an independent course, right? But what about something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is, I think, close to 40% of the world's population inside it, and say 31% of the world's GDP or something? What about something like BRICS, which has, again, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, again, all huge countries, global representation. They also have a bank, which is called the New Development Bank, which can lend money, right? So all of these, I think, provided the re-emergence of some of these, or the renewed discussion about some of these bodies, has also given a fillip to the idea of how de-dollarization is possible. But like I said, and of course, sorry, the last thing I think we should mention is also the pandemic. And I think the pandemic taught us some very important lessons. One is the fact that when it comes to even when it comes to the question of survival, capitalism is no conscience. So I mean, earlier you could some nice-hearted people used to say that, see, capitalism's ultimate aim is to make profit. For that, they want healthy workers. So they'll somehow manage education. They'll give you minimum health so that you're healthy enough to work and make profits. But I think the pandemic showed that all of that was complete hogwash. During the pandemic, Jeff Bezos' wealth increased by tons. Even in India, even in any country across the world, during the pandemic, the richest 1%'s wealth increased massively, while workers were struggling without bathroom breaks inside closed spaces, where they were more at risk of catching COVID-19. People were laid off their jobs in which they had worked for many years. People who had jobs were forced to come in and work even when they were unwell. Many sections of workers were declared essential workers, and they were made to work, but they never got the benefits for that kind of work. And alongside all this, the pandemic also showed that when it came to the issue of debt, which the countries of the global south is a huge issue for the countries of the global south, especially in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. There was no mercy from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or any of these institutions. They made some noises, made some cosmetic measures, but still the issue of debt continues, although the cancellation of debt has been such a powerful global slogan. So I think there are many questions about a new kind of global financial architecture that people are talking about these days. Is renewed interest. But like I said, a lot of this is still in its very, very early stages. So it's still very early to say that if two countries are deciding that they will trade in their currencies, like Brazil and China decided that they will trade in yuan and reals, which are their currencies. That's definitely a positive step. But it also poses questions. India and Russia decided the same, but this is in some ways. But Russia now has an excess of Indian rupees, and it doesn't really know what to do with it. So there are these kind of questions, what becomes the reserve currency? All these are, I think, unanswered questions. It's not very clear. There's still a long way to go before it reaches any sustainable direction, so to speak. But I think there are definitely certain starting points to it, which are very, very interesting. And this is the global, I think, geopolitical situation which has sort of enabled it, that there is the United States, which is clearly a declining economic power, but which retains a military edge that makes it a true threat to people across the world.
Okay, so comrade, I mean, looking at what you were saying just now, are we really looking at a revival of, as you know, back in 1955, after the World War II, there was this Bandung conference. Mainly the leaders such as Nasir, even Prime Minister Nehru, Sukarno, all of these people came together and basically to put forward an alternative, the non-aligned movement, to offer an alternative to the global capitalist system, and to provide an economic model, or to, in a way, redefine economic development in their own context. So do you think that we are seeing another realignment of countries? Maybe they are looking for the big powers to come together first so they can at least rely, maybe it's China and Russia. But do you think the global south will sort of also come into this realignment away from the US? not relying too much on the US economy. Do you think we are seeing a revival of the spirit of the Bandung 1955?
It's a very, I think, interesting and important question. I would say there is a yes and a no to that answer, in the sense that let's go to the positive side first. Like you said, there's a yes in that question, to the extent that, like we just talked about, there is a renewed interest in some of these forums like BRICS, SCO, and I think even, for instance, when you're talking about climate change, it's interesting to note that at the recent in Egypt, during the recent climate change discussions that took place, there was a very strong lobby of poorer countries. I think it's called the G77 plus China, which very strongly pushed for what is called a loss and damage fund, which is to help poorer countries deal with climate change. And this was one after this concession. It was, it is not actually, concession is the wrong word. This right, technically, was one after a long fight by these countries. So we are, I think, seeing many of these global fora and moments and spaces for countries to come together and kind of do these, make these collaborations and coalitions, which are actually very useful. And I think that there is a lot of scope for this to sort of grow. On the other hand, I think that we have still not exactly reached that, the kind of what the non-aligned movement represented was, while the name is often, name non-alignment is often, it gives the impression that it's a non-things, like but non-alignment is actually a very positive ideology in some senses. It was a very inspiring vision. It was a vision for the global south, where countries from across the world, and there was a long history to it as well. There were all these countries which came out of national liberation movements, which had fought the colonial powers, coming together and saying that, we want a different kind of world. We want a world of justice. We want a world where we are treated as equal players on the table. We want a world where, where old colonial powers can no longer continue being neo-colonial under different terms of trade. And it is not just an international order. Its impacts came to culture. Its impacts came to media. Its impacts came to so many allied projects, and even affected the United Nations. In fact, the US and all had a huge problem with the extent to which that kind of a framework was entering the United Nations in various discussions. And there is a history of a long series of documents which are produced by the UN and associated agencies in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s especially, which talk about the various building blocks of this new order. So, have we reached that stage yet? I would definitely say there's a long way to go before going there, and I think that's very important. And I suspect that one current crisis we are facing is that for a lot of countries, they are using what in some contexts is being referred to as strategic autonomy, where they are, it is often not so much a principled position, and as much as a convenient position. At this point of time, it makes sense for us because, say, X country is a strong trading partner. We don't want to put sanctions against them. But tomorrow, if sanctions are imposed against Y, we don't mind so much, right? So that has become a bit more of a norm than earlier what used to be, where, for instance, an online movement was a strong supporter of the Palestinian cause, right? It was a strong supporter of the cause of liberation movements across the world. That is very important to its agenda as well. So, to what extent are those values still there in these movements? I think in this moment is actually a very important question, and I think it is. And what I'm saying is not something idealistic, right? What I'm saying, it's not like, we don't want some. It's not a dreamy idea that we should that countries should support a series of principles, including non-interference in each other's affairs, including an end to all these kind of sanctions. These have concrete material impact on people's lives. These have concrete material impact on the on the development of countries, and these are impact on the way in which future generations are also going to develop. So there needs to be, I think, a more expanded understanding of how this new order is can be created and what its foundations are. And I think we are still a bit away from there. One positive thing I think about this would be the fact that we are seeing that there is a bit more focus on regional solutions to regional problems, which I think is definitely a good sign, and maybe it is one of the building blocks of this future order as well. that we don't want the United States to suggest how problems in West Asia should be solved, or for that matter, how problems in Southeast Asia should be solved. Uh, Problems in Southeast Asia should be solved by the countries of Southeast Asia, or problems in South Asia should be solved by the countries of South Asia working together. You don't have to agree on everything. That's never going to happen. But can these countries reach a stage of accord where, keeping some disagreements around, you can still manage to have a working relationship? Like, for instance, I think that attempt is still to some extent ongoing in Afghanistan, where everyone is concerned. China is concerned, India is concerned, Pakistan is concerned, Russia is concerned, the Central Asian republics. So there is, I think, a realization that the solution needs to be regional, because the US came and left, right? Or for that matter, West Asia, Iran and Saudi Arabia are talking to each other today. Saudi Arabia and Syria are talking to each other today. All these countries were still are rivals. There's nobody's saying they're friends, but despite their rivalries, despite their enmities, the fact that they can talk together, they can negotiate, reach certain agreements, all these are definitely positive signs. So I would see all of these, the kind of new financial architecture, regional solutions to regional problems, call for demilitarization, an end to sort of this Cold War mentality, an end to sanctions, the call for that. All of these are, I think, key building blocks of what could be a new moment like that. But it also has to, like I said, it has to be more comprehensive. And I think it's up to international community as well to ask these questions of these governments and countries, put them as well on many of these issues. I think one of the things the non-aligned movement successfully did was it was able to emerge as a key force in many conflicts, in the resolution of many conflicts. I believe, for instance, India and other countries were involved in some kind of resolution in the Korean War as well, the armistice, not the entire this thing. But so today, that gap is clearly being felt. The fact in the Russia-Ukraine war, the fact that there is no, Turkey is the closest that has come to being a mediator, but that there is no block of countries which can step in and say that, I think we need to have a different approach to this, because otherwise there is just escalation, and we're talking about nuclear powers, and all it needs is one bad decision, and everyone is going to suffer for decades. So I think there is a strong need for these kind of blocks to definitely emerge, and a strong need for, I think, a more positive and a more comprehensive agenda for them as well.
Yeah. So talking about this new world order and possibly putting up an alternative to the global capitalist system, but I think a lot of people also forget there are a lot of achievements which is happening in separate countries, even in India, in Kerala, in Latin America, and so on. So, comrade, you are from Kerala, so I think I should ask you this question. Recently, I know there's a lot of hype about this Kerala story for wrong reasons, I suppose. But I think there's a lot of people are not talking about the real Kerala story, the achievements of the left governments for many, many terms. And even currently, we have the Chief Minister Pinarani, who's doing great work. So these are things that does not come out in the corporate world, which is dominating the news, international news today. So actually, what is the left government actually doing in Kerala? What are the achievements? Maybe you should share with us.
And this is a good time to talk about it, because the LDF, the left government, is called the Left Democratic Front government in Kerala. It comprises the Communist Party of India Marxist, the Communist Party of India, some other smaller parties as well. It's a very unique experiment in Indian history, because I think generally, to go back to a bit of history as well, the communists have always been strong in certain parts of India, especially they also played a very important role in the freedom movement, in the anti-colonial movement. And in certain parts, they also were very successful electorally. And Kerala is, after independence, and Kerala is actually one of those places where the communist movement has contributed to building a very powerful culture that is not just an electoral culture, but also has entered into the social realm as well, into society, into the arts and crafts, into culture, knowledge dimensions, into public discourse, into the media. So it's sometimes very difficult to sort of measure the impact of the left in a state like Kerala. Kerala is actually a very small state. It's a densely populated state, but it's a very small state. And I think one of the interesting things about what has happened over the past many decades in Kerala is that in some senses it has bucked, or it has contradicted what has been certain trends in India overall. And for that context, I also need to explain that after independence for a few decades, India followed a policy whereby it called itself socialist, and there was a lot of investment in state enterprises, public sector, etc., which is great. But there were many other aspects of the socialist project which were not executed, in the sense of larger community participation, a willingness to engage with, say, the social oppression, social exclusion. All of that was not really properly addressed as much as it should have. So, socialism in the larger Indian context mainly referred to a strong public sector and some policies, welfare policies, which benefited the poor. But even this changed after 1990, when the Indian government launched what is called a process of liberalization, privatization, and globalization. And as part of that, as the name suggests, there was a huge privatization of government enterprises. A lot of these the whole emphasis was on how to bring more private capital into India. For that, the attempt was to reduce the rights of workers in various ways. The agricultural sector suffered a huge hit. A lot of farmers committed suicide, and there's a big problems in that sector as well. And in addition to that, we also had the global trade mechanism itself really made farmers suffer. For instance, the kind of imports that were taking place. And in addition to that, we also had a value system around that, because this is not only an economic policy. This is also a value system which says that where individualism gets more focus, there is the idea of community or working together, or a collective struggle and consciousness starts receding or retreating because of these kind of values. So what is interesting about, I think, the Kerala model, so to speak, is that it has tried to push back against all of these values, all of these aspects in various ways. So to give you a very simple example, there is a paper mill, and this is one micro example. There's a paper mill which was recently recommissioned by the government and the Kerala government, the LDF government. And just to again give some context, this current left front government has been in power since 2016. So it was in power from 2016 to 2021, and from 21 it won another election, and it continues. So this is it's gone into its third year. So this paper mill, if I'm not mistaken, if memory serves me right, was actually a public sector enterprise which had pretty much shut down and gone into huge losses and shut down, because again of the policies of the national level policies of the government and earlier state governments in Kerala as well. So under this government, this public sector enterprise was actually revived and is now functioning extremely well. And this might seem like a small example, but if you think about it, it's very unique. Where have we heard of in the past 30 years? How many occasions have we heard of a failing government enterprise being revived and becoming successful? Right. That seems unbelievable in today's age, when everyone is telling you that the government sector is doomed, public sector is doomed. The only option is to privatize.
Yes, they'll leave it or just privatize.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So either shut it down or privatize it. Those are the only two options that all your governments are presenting before you. But here we have an example of a failing and ailing enterprise which is taken over, which is strengthened by the government and now is successful. Or for the fact that I think there are numbers which show to the extent to which school children have actually been leaving private schools and rejoining government schools. And in fact, over the past 5-6 years, there's been a surge in admissions in government schools. Again, rarely you hear about it, because again, the dominant narrative is government schools are inefficient, government teachers are lazy, the best option is to go to a private school, that will make your students more competitive. But here, as they say, parents are deciding or replying to their argument on their legs by actually moving their children to a public sector school. So just to give you a certain sense of 2 or 3 examples of that. Or let's take another example, and this is a far more famous example of the pandemic. Right. So during the pandemic,
So when you're saying about the education, you mean that there was some sort of a great initiative to invest more in public sector schools, and thus thereby raising its quality, so that more people are sending.
Yes.
Was that a...
Yes, I think that it's twofold. One is, of course, a definite improvement in infrastructure. That definitely happened, no doubts about that. But I think there was also a very concerted attempt at a community level to sort of, you know, raise awareness about these schools, raise parents' participation and interest in these schools, and also I think give the teachers who are also organized into unions and stuff like that a greater sense of participation in the project. So it is both, of course, a financial incentive, you know, push through money and infrastructure, but also I think the approach of the government and the political project itself, which says that the left is not, you know, the public sector is not just something you throw away, but something that you need to support wholeheartedly, right? So and I think the experiment shows that it is possible with the right amount of political will. It is possible to it is possible to ensure that the public sector remains profitable. It is possible to ensure that public sector schools are good. And once again, to give you an example of the health sector, which is very again important, because during the pandemic, Kerala was one of the first states to be hit, because Kerala has an extensive population of expatriates who go, you know, with a lot of travel happening. So Kerala was one of the first states to be hit. And what was interesting about Kerala's approach was that from the very top, from the top of the government itself to the to the bottommost government official in the hierarchy, there was a very structured approach to handling the pandemic, and that made it actually, I think, one of the most effective examples of handling the pandemic in the world. To give you a very good example, the fact that, like for instance, when if somebody did catch COVID-19, there would be multiple aspects of the government machinery calling, ringing you, coming to your homes. Simultaneously, at the same time, the Communist Party and its various mass organizations, its youth wings, its student wings, they were doing food delivery projects. At that point, the government conducted a very extensive food grain package as well, which it is giving to poor families. Just before that, the government had a pension scheme, which is still ongoing, which was very effective in reaching out to slightly older people, senior citizens as well. So there was this mix of both administrative measures and I think a popular political mobilization. Like for instance, while on the one hand you would have government officials calling people who have been affected by COVID-19, or there would be small de facto centers. There were a lot of centers set up where people could recover. Like if they were living with a family or group and one of them got COVID-19, they could go and spend some time there free of cost. You would get food as well. But at the same time, young communist workers were delivering food as well to the remaining family members. If they were senior citizens, they were helping them with buying groceries. And this was not done in a charity mode. This was political work. So a combination of these two approaches, I think, really sort of, at the same time, for instance, the Kerala government set up hotels for migrant workers.
Oh, okay.
So Kerala has a huge migrant population from other states in India, so who had come to Kerala at that time. So the government set up made food arrangements for them as well. And very early on, the government said that we should not treat these migrants as foreigners. They're working here. They're part of building Kerala, right? So that was very interesting. And this happened at the same time where in Delhi, for instance, we saw that when the pandemic hit, there was a huge migration outside.
Yes, we saw that in the news.
Tens of thousands of people walking on the roads, no food, no resources.
Yes.
People sometimes even dying on the roads, right? So at the same time, we have the left government here saying that, we are going to go all out, even at a time of danger, even at a time of fear, when your response is to always look at the outsider with some amount of skepticism. Say that is not going to happen here, right? So that's again, and this got a lot of praise, but I think one of the biggest these things is that I know of people who are very strongly anti-left, anti-communist, anti-left, who themselves during the pandemic said that, see, whatever it is, you have to give it, you have to accept that.
Give credit to.
Yeah. So that I think, and again, maybe finally there's a lot to say, but one interesting, you referred to Chief Minister Pinarayi Vijayan, who made it a habit to sort of give a press conference every day. And this was interesting because it started out as an update, but over time it became a ritual.
I see.
Right. So over time, the Chief Minister comes at around, I believe it was 6:30 in the evening or maybe earlier, and he gives an update in a very factual, no drama kind of, okay, this has happened, these many cases, these many deaths, this is a government strategy right now, this is what we're doing. He takes questions, and it became a kind of moment for the whole families to sort of gather and get information. It became a public education exercise because he would warn about, say, sometimes not going in for superstitious ways of dealing with the disease, following the scientific method, all that kind of stuff.
Like what Bodhi said to knock on the pants.
Exactly. So all that was not in the picture.
Yeah.
So that, for again, a very interesting example of how this turns into a political moment.
Yes.
Right. So I think what these governments have very successfully done is to, within the limitations of Indian democracy, and like many liberal democracies, Indian democracy has a lot of limitations. Within the limitations of this democracy, it has managed to expand democratic values. It has managed to, I would say, lay the building blocks for a political democracy, so to speak, which is really which is really important. And this is not just about welfare measures. Welfare measures are a key part of it. Improving the state sector is a key part of it. Say improving quality of life is a key part of it. But that's only one part of it. The point is also around it to build a political culture which continues this process, and so the key point, I think, is that the people are not recipients of welfare, right? People are not getting welfare because the government is kind enough to say, okay, keep some rice. That's not the idea. The idea is to have it's not just a right, it's part of a political it's a basic political it's a question of dignity. It's a basic political demand, so to speak. So that process, I think, is what Kerala has done very successfully. I mean, there are a lot of numbers. I don't want to sort of go into the numbers,
right?
But I think this is a sort of larger picture.
Yes. So, Kamra, I think this we just been talking about Kerala itself, but these are stories that people never really talk about, And even in Malaysia, we only receive, like, there's only one version of the news. It's either about Modi and how he's so great in bringing in investment to India. So there's only like a very monolithic type of news that we get. I think it's quite similar also, all the achievements in Latin America, the people's movements, the social programs they're doing in Venezuela, and currently the left governments in Bolivia and so on. But unfortunately, leaving out people who are social activists and people on the left, what can you say to the common people? Because that the whole international global news platform has been taken over by the corporate side. It's just Reuters, CNN. So the whole narrative is determined by them. And people really, they don't know where to source for alternative news to get the real story. And that sort of hinders in any kind of project that we want to build a better world, a new alternative. So I know you are involved in a lot of media work, and the main thing is that to put forward the alternative news itself. So to the common people, not people who are involved in any kind of organizations, not people who are in PSM or in the left, what can you say to them? How can they get real news to really sift through the news which has been cluttered with all kind of propaganda by the West? And so what would you advise? Where do we get this real news?
Right. So, there are two answers, I think, to that question. One is, of course, I can talk a bit about organizations which do this kind of news. But I think equally importantly is also, I think, the question of perspective. And I think that we're living at a time when the mainstream media is out to tell us that there is only one social there's only one way of organizing society, and that is capitalism. And that has been for 30 years, 35 years, we've been fed. I think before that, there used to be much more diversity. There would be various viewpoints of view and all that. Now, a lot of that diversity has actually come down in terms of the media space. And all of us are sort of in various ways taught to believe that the only way to do things is capitalism. And what does that imply? It implies that, for instance, one, you are told that you should care really only about yourself, right? And yourself, as in yourself, your immediate family, etc., etc. Point number two, you are told that selfishness is good, or greed / selfishness / ambition is the way of the world. There's no real other way of doing things. It's a dog eat dog world, survival of the fittest. All those kind of ideologies are very much in our this thing. Third, we are told to admire the success stories of people who have become very rich, like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or all these kind of people. They are the heroes of our world today. What they do, or celebrities who are very rich like them do, are basically what is held up as a role model for us. Point number 4, we're sort of generally told that what is important is that we work and follow the rules, and then automatically all of society kind of, we'll get what we should ideally get, and it will trickle down, so to speak.
Yeah, trickle down.
The rich will make money. If we work hard, we'll get some of it. That's again something that we've been told. Now, I think the important part of all of this is that all of this is completely untrue. And time and again, we see all of this, the fact that this is untrue and how the world pans out. I was, like, for instance, talking about Kerala. Like, Kerala was hit by 2 very disastrous rounds of floods from 2016 to 18. And during that time period, I think what is remarkable about what we saw in Kerala is the fact, and I think any part of the world, in fact, I'm talking about Kerala because I'm from there, but in 2015, I was in another state, I was in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu. There also the same thing happened. You see these remarkable examples of people, when emergencies happen, people, going to extreme ends to actually help others. We've seen often spaces of mass protest breaking out, where people set up libraries, they set up kitchens, they set up community spaces. So the fact that, we are a individual centric society, or that everything, we just need to think about, so if X is one person and society is just 1 million X's, right? That is a complete, because society is not just a collection of individuals. It is the interactions between individuals, the kind of power structures that are there, all those are as important as individuals themselves. So when we look at how the world is organized, when we look at a world where Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos are the heroes, when we look at a world where the top 1% owns as much wealth as 30 or 40%, I think it is extremely clear that this is an unfair world, that this is a world that is not, the way society is organized is not right, and that the reason, it is increasingly clear that I think the work we do, that the work most people do, the people only a small section benefits out of it, who are the rich, and the work people do is really, the pandemic, like I said, really proved that.
Yes.
Time and again it proved that, because even regardless of whether you are poor or middle class or even upper middle class, your work was often at risk. Today, for instance, you have IT professionals in various countries, in India being fired, across the world being fired. Companies like Facebook or Google firing tens of thousands of engineers and IT professionals. So it's not that they didn't work hard or they were not educated. All of these people spent. So I think all these myths are, if we spend some time just stopping and thinking about it, all these are myths. It's very clear. Now the question is then, how do we sort of take ourselves out of these myths? How do we sort of find information about that? And there I think we need to realize that the second point, which is that the media is definitely not neutral or objective, like you were saying. There is absolutely no concept called an objective or neutral media, because at the end of the day, the media, the media is owned by certain people. And if you look at any country in the world, if you look at who owns the main big media, it is usually some of the richest people in alliance with some of the most powerful politicians who are definitely pushing an agenda. Like in India, a large chunk of the media is owned by the 2 richest people in India. If you go to a country like Brazil, there is a global media network, which is this vast conglomerate which is basically, almost owns all of a lot of media in Brazil. If you go to the US, you have 5 or 6 big companies which own all the media in the US, all the big media in the US. And this is true in country after country. So how do you expect that this media, which is very narrow and owned by a few people, is going to give you a diversity of views, or is going to make you challenge the system? So I think from there we need to move on to the next question, which is really that, where are these attempts to challenge the system taking place? Right? And there you gave some examples, like of course Kerala is one example, you have Venezuela, you have Cuba, you have Bolivia, And in each of these countries, I think then the next question that is, that people will say, oh, these are dictators, these are authoritarians, etc., etc. But for instance, it's funny, Venezuela, you say that about Venezuela, but Venezuela has actually had more elections in the past many years than the US has.
Yes.
And they have an extremely solid election system, which has been certified by, among other people, US agencies also. So observers from across the world have come there and certified that these have been fair elections. If you look at Cuba, Cuba has an extremely interesting election system for its parliament. Among other things, the Cuban, to become the president of Cuba, you need to be a member of parliament. And in the Cuban parliamentary election system, the way they do it is that you can be nominated as a candidate, and then you need to have discussions with a wide variety of people. You need to present your agenda. There's no real, you can't throw around money and become an MP there. You need to really slog. You need to really go and present your agenda in front of people. You need to take part in town halls. You need to do a lot of legwork in the campaign itself. And even before that, you need to be often a representative of some kind of social organization, a youth organization, a women's organization before. So Cuba has a very fascinating way of electing members to parliament. In Cuba, you do not get a salary for becoming a parliamentary member, a member of parliament. So it is considered a service to the country. So you're supposed to do it without, getting paid for it. So the question is, why would we not want to learn these experiences, right? Why would we not want to show interest in these experiences where people are experimenting with democracy? Why would you assume that the only democracy is the democracy where elections are held once in every few years, the richest people become members of parliament? Once they become members of parliament, their relatives and friends benefit. But why is that the only way of the world? Right. So I think when you talk about democracy, and often we talk about democracy in ways like this, we say, oh, okay, Cuba is this kind of a country, but we are democracy because we hold elections. But Cuba also holds elections. We don't know about it because the media never talks about it.
Yes.
Or if the media talks about it, they will say that, oh, these are elections, but they're not done in the way we want it. But my question would be, for instance, what right does the US have to talk about elections when the Supreme Court basically gave big corporations in the US the right to throw as much money as they wish to a candidate? So big companies in the US can spend huge amounts, and this was permitted. So there's something called a super PAC, which can throw unlimited amounts of money in elections. And same thing happening in India, same thing happening in so many parts of the world. Social media like Facebook is used as a tool for this kind of throwing in massive amounts of money. So is that democratic? So I think those are the questions, and then from there we move on to what are the kind of sources. Like, of course, I come from People's Dispatch. There's an organization called Breakthrough News in the US, which does some very interesting news. In Brazil, we have an organization called Brazil de Fato, very fascinating news from the whole continent as a whole. And in India, we have an organization called NewsClick as well, which provides Indian news from an Indian context. So all these are, I think, there are a lot of examples of organizations which produce amazing news. But I think the perspective is as important as well.
Yes. Okay, I think we've been discussing on a lot of issues recently, and thanks, Prasanth, for giving us your views and enlightening us on many things that we really didn't know. I think it's also very important that after this, so please, those who are keen to know more about these issues, please follow us in Parti Sosialis Malaysia, and also do look at People's Dispatch, and to get to really understand the world that we live in today, and ask us important questions. Is there another better world that we can strive for, and why we don't do so? Right?
Absolutely.
So thank you, Prasanth, for joining us,
so much.
and that's all we have for now. Thank you.